Welcome to this session on correlating resonance. This picture is an aerial view of the Australian landscape. So now you know why Indigenous Australian dot paintings look the way they do. My name is Jeff Ebbs. I know some of you from IST 2022, where I presented a short paper. I'm joined here in Oslo by my colleague Lewis Sanzoni. Lewis, Luke and I are from Griffith University in Queensland, Australia. In this session, we'll explore why we developed this approach of correlating resonance, how we actually apply it to a set of data, and finally, why we think this might be of importance to you and others in our field. I want to start with a quick summary of what I presented at IST 2022. So I come to the Academy from industry. I wanted to apply academic rigour to understand why it's so hard for SMEs to put sustainable development into practice. I thought I might connect theory and practice using Checkland's approach and finding a way to map relevant theory to specific problems. When I was at IST 2022, we designed our research but hadn't really solved the problem of how we were going to do the correlation. Our framework of ideas is a typology of research concepts, which we compared to a typology of practitioner concepts. And so by correlating the resonance between the two, we were hoping to create a framework of meaning, a three-dimensional matrix, and literally position problems and solutions within that typology, and so match the solution closest to the problem, basic proximity analysis. So here we see three different clusters positioned in a three-dimensional space with the axes based on the major groupings of concepts. We use that approach to identify clusters of practitioners. So the yellow circles represent clusters found in the research papers. The blue hexagons represent clusters identified in conversations with practitioners. Another difference between researchers and practitioners was the emphasis on complexity in the research, but a focus on outcomes in the practice. There was also common ground. Both research and practice identified tension between outcomes of economic growth and sustainability. More surprisingly, they also identified that practitioners focused on social justice had a lot of tension with practitioners focused on environmental outcomes. In fact, what we identified is that the best indicator of behaviour or of people's response is an understanding of their configuration of beliefs. So I might care about social justice more than the environment. You care about using a profit to achieve environmental impact. So these configuration of beliefs or intentions are the focus of our approach. I started to wonder about the relationship between this dissonance, as we call it, in the intentions and the role of complexity in wicked problems. So Grubb's ordering complexity sets out to craft energy policy, but it specifically identifies the focus of complexity in theoretical research and the focus on normative intent in the economic research. So it was foundational in triggering this investigation of responses to complexity. Mercura uses modelling to advise policymakers on taxation to influence electric vehicle purchases. I've highlighted this paper because of its focus on heterogeneous agents. Different groups of people behave in different ways. His modelling goes to develop policy that accounts for the complexity caused by those differences. So a different way of simplifying the complexity of managing sustainability transitions is specifically introduces the idea of a common vision, a common normative goal. Robert's framework for strategic sustainable development proposes a common vision and then a process to iteratively converge on that. Krumdiek refines that to get engineers to focus on engineering to reduce climate emissions. Mayer Goepel adds normative intent to the multi-level protocol. She does that in the form of two new layers, you and me as individuals who discuss ideas that influence the regime and also contribute to a narrative that shifts the paradigm that shapes the landscape. So it creates a pincher movement to overcome the inertia of the regime by building the momentum that supports innovation in the niche. So in most socio-technical examples, that momentum comes from consumer attraction towards the technology, which is not inherent in sustainability. So at this point in my research, the UN released its Times of Crisis, Times of Change report. That's 9 months ago. And as a result, I read a whole bunch of research on the normative dissonance implicit in the SDGs. What if sustainability and development are not compatible? It became brutally obvious that the tension between economic growth and sustainable outcomes was not particular to my Queensland sustainable food providers. So the problem with assuming a common vision as a way of driving outcomes is that we may not be able to achieve that. We can get consensus at a high level. We don't want the world to fry, so we want to avoid climate change, but that consensus falls apart as soon as we get down to the detail of implementation. At that point, I went back to the data. I started to look in more detail at the agreement and disagreement, the resonance and dissonance between concepts. So instead of trying to match solutions to problems, I now focused on just trying to understand the problem. Here's typical output from a thematical analysis of concepts in a set of papers. The papers are the rows and the concepts are the columns. So counting how often any particular concept appears in a paper is pretty standard practice. I found myself looking for concepts that appeared together often. I realised I could shortcut this with the sum of products calculation, which is a straightforward inversion of a standard Hamming distance calculation. That results in a map of resonance between each pair of concepts, which is essentially symmetrical. Every concept resonates with itself, so we get a line along the diagonal. I disrupted this perfect symmetry by weighting it to preserve relative significance. All businesses care about money, but not all conversations about money concern business. So the resonance is directional. Now, at that point, Dr. Zanzoni started to tear his hair out. He had quite a full head of hair when I met him 2 years ago, a quick glance at the man realises how much damage I've done to him. He requested a comparison with existing clustering methods. I used a range of methods to cluster the text by concept and to compare that with what happens when I clustered the correlated concepts with each other and then applied that back to the texts. The outcome of that finding was that it didn't matter whether I correlated the concepts first and then used a clustering method on the correlated concepts or whether I used the clustering method directly on the papers. I ended up with similar results. So the columns at the right show the agreement between those different methods. The other thing that was obvious from that analysis of different clustering methods is that each clustering method consistently isolated the most important concepts and the least important concepts. Where they got a little bit variable was on the concepts in the middle. So here are the same set of results following a simple sort of the data. So I sorted the rows and columns to identify the most and least important and see what kinds of clusters emerged in the middle. We developed an algorithm that simply picks the corner closest to the middle of the diagram and then moves the columns and rows to eliminate the white pixels from that cluster. Having consolidated the first cluster, then we can iteratively repeat the process moving down the diagonal. As a result, we end up with something that looks like this. So the colour coding identifies clusters of concepts with different configurations of agreement. So the most common beliefs. The brown clusters agree with most of the other areas. So we can see that both the yellow clusters and the blue clusters agree strongly with the brown ones, but the blue and yellow don't agree strongly with each other. So even just at that high level, we have 3 clusters that have different relationships with each other. We call the result a stingray diagram. Now, Luke wants to call it a stealth bomber diagram. I say stealth bomber is a biomimicry of a stingray, and why take the copy when you can have the original? So in this diagram, let's say we applied this diagram to Sustainable Development Goals. We can see 3 main clusters of concepts, 3 big stingrays. Conceptually, this might represent the focus on development at the top, the focus on sustainability, the second biggest stingray, and then the last smallest stingray will be degrowth. So I've labelled the small clusters at the head and the tail of the stingray because they are the ones that disagree or agree most strongly. So we're leaving aside the variable ones. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to move on to the theoretical implications of this. So I can come back to any questions you've got about this analysis during questions. I just want to note the difference between cluster 2 and cluster 5. So if cluster 2 is growth at all costs, there is very little agreement between those and the degrowth people. Because I'm highlighting that now because I want to come back to that later when we talk about the implications of this. So you've got an overview now of what we mean when we're talking about correlating resonance. Now I want to focus on what we can do with that, what use it might be to you and to other people in our field of inquiry. So we started out to document the thematic analysis and to compare themes using numerical and arithmetic rigour, and the approach consistently does that. Where we diverted was we started to analyse dissonance and resonance as one of the outcomes that we can get from just having a numerical documentation of the themes. Where it gets really interesting is when we use this stingray diagram as a truth table. And so that is what we call configuration analysis, which comes from a 1963 thing called personality construct theory, developed by George Kelly and updated and polished by Dr. Sansoni and others in 2011. So what we are looking at here is the use of columns 2, 4 and 5 as unique indicators of which of the 5 rows we're in. And so we can see that if we treat them as Boolean on and off, then column 1 can be identified as on, off, and column 5 as off, on, for example. So that gives us a very fast way to start to cluster texts. We can take a couple of key concepts from each of those 3 columns, and then we can check a new paper that's never been coded before to see if those key concepts are considered important or not in that paper. And that immediately gives us a very quick way to identify which of the 5 clusters it belongs to. So we don't have to redo the cluster analysis every time we want to import a body of papers into our overall discussion. That allows us to do a number of things. We can cluster our existing text. We can assign new text to existing clusters. We can import a new set of papers and cluster them and assign them to our body of papers. We can also reveal new clusters. So with 3 on-off switches, we should be able to identify 8 sets of clusters, but some of them don't appear. Take the example that we used before of the growth at all cost people in cluster 2 and the degrowth people in cluster 5. They don't have much in common. They didn't appear together. Those 2 concepts didn't appear together, or those 2 configurations of beliefs didn't appear together in any of the papers that we had. What happens if we put those people in a room, or if we deliberately go out and look for research that compares and contrasts those two groups? We might find some interesting outcomes. I tried that in my community garden. I live with a whole lot of growth at all costs people, and it turns out that we have in common, we both like locally grown nutritious food, and we both consider cash to be important. So the reasons that we have those views are somewhat different, but at least we have a point of agreement, and we now are working together on a community garden using cash to pay for our goods, and that is at least a start on working together and cooperating for a set of outcomes. So we tested this approach on a second data set, 180 submissions to the Australian Government's inquiry into food security. So this confirmed our overall conclusion that instead of trying to simplify complexity by reducing the problem and finding an optimum solution, we need to embrace the complexity and adopt the plurality of solutions, each tailored to some segment of society that self-identifies with a configuration of intentions. In the case of food security, the health system, social welfare and education advocates who see food as an instrumental building block of social wellness got completely sidelined in the findings. They were normatively dissonant with the most general findings. Take a different example and let's look at what happens when we apply the stingray to intersectional feminism. The head of the largest stingray might be considered gender equality. So the majority of TEG's advocacy and the policies that result from that are based on the principle of treating women equally to men. Feminism is about equality. But First Nation women in Australia reject the idea of equality. They believe that there is women's business and men's difference. They want to emphasise the respect those differences. Out of that recognition comes respect. So the intersection between gender and the politics of decolonisation is an example of the wicked problems that emerge when we ignore the complexities of intersectionality. Doesn't matter whether it's feminism or the SDGs, generally speaking, we can find broad agreement at the meta level. We don't want women to be beaten up and killed. We don't want civilization to fry because of climate change. But that consensus starts to break down when we get into the detail of implementation. It's our hope that correlating resonance offers a mapping process to identify and develop pathways to manage the process of implementation by taking that complexity into account. Thanks very much for your time. We'll come back and take questions at the end, I believe. Thank you very much.